When the year 52 BC began, the Roman people had not yet elected the year's senior political office holders. Repeated outbreaks of mob violence had stopped elections from being held. The spiral of violence continued. Milo and Clodius, two rival politicians responsible for much of the violence in Rome, met, probably by accident, on the Appian Way, south of the city. A brawl broke out between their armed retinues.
When Clodius had looked back at the affray in a threatening manner, Berea pierced his shoulder with a spear. Next, since a pitched battle had developed, more of Milo's supporters ran up to help. The wounded Clodius was carried to a nearby inn located in the area of Bovilii. As soon as he found out that Clodius was wounded, Milo ordered that he be ejected from the inn, for he understood that it would be even more dangerous for him with Clodius alive, but that he would have a great consolation if Clodius was killed, even if a penalty had to be paid. Thus the concealed Clodius was dragged out and finished off with many wounds.
So the murder of Clodius in 52 BC in an outburst of armed violence was really no surprise, because naked violence had become an endemic part of Roman political life since the murder of the tribune Tiberius Gracchus 80 years earlier. So this resort to violence had become more and more common as conservative politicians, the so-called optimates on the one hand, tried to block the actions of the more radical populist politicians on the other. And the politics were much more extreme in this period. I mean, the old consensus politics of the earlier 2nd century, when there was usually some sort of compromise found between rival factions of the aristocracy, that sort of consensus had broken down completely by the time we'd reached 52 BC.
After the affray on the Appian Way, Clodius' corpse was returned to the city of Rome. In life, Clodius had been skilled at manipulating the urban plebs and inciting them to violence. Now, his close supporters followed in his footsteps and orchestrated mob violence.
Clodius's body was brought in before the first hour of the evening. A large crowd of the humblest plebeians and slaves, lamenting greatly, stood around the body, which was placed in the atrium of Clodius's house. His wife, Fulvia, was magnifying the indignation concerning the deed. She was displaying his wounds with unrestrained wailing.
Now, it is true that Publius Clodius was one of the most extreme politicians to use violence in the history of the Roman Republic. And he was particularly clever in using the urban trade associations, the so-called collegia, to organize his gangs of thugs in the back streets of the city. And of course, these thugs were used to put pressure, to threaten politicians, or occasionally to attack them outright physically in public. And even as we move into this late Republican period, politicians started to hire or even purchase trained gladiators to be part of these gangs. There were certainly gladiators in Milo's gang on that fatal confrontation in 52 on the Via Appia, where Clodius was killed. So I think this all suggests that violence had become endemic in Roman public life and was indeed now even more sophisticated and even better organized by members of the Roman political elite. And Roman politicians by this stage of Roman history had no qualms about using even trained killers to achieve their political objectives.
When the people were in this state, Rufus and Titus Munatius Plancus got control of them and incited them further. For at dawn, the tribunes carried the corpse into the forum, placed it on the rostra, and displayed it to everyone. They lamented and said the appropriate things. As a result, the crowd was stirred up by what they were seeing and hearing. It was no longer concerned for what was holy and sacred, but violated every custom concerning burial and burnt down almost the whole city. They picked up Clodius's body and carried it into the Senate house. They laid it out, and after this, having heaped up a pyre using the benches, they burnt both it and the Senate house.
The burning of the Senate House shook the Roman political establishment to its core. Even before the murder of Clodius, the rising political violence had prompted talk that autocratic rule was necessary to restore order. Now this became a reality.
The Senate came together with alarm and looked to Pompey, intending that he should immediately be their dictator. But Cato pointed out an alternative to them. They appointed Pompey as consul without a colleague, so that governing alone, he might have the dictator's power and the consul's accountability. Pompey was the first consul to have 2 of the largest provinces, and an army, and public funds, and autocratic rule over the city, because he was sole consul.
By the time Clodius was murdered in January of 52, Pompey, of course, had built up an extremely powerful position in Rome. And then, of course, if we turn our view to Gaul, this was the decade, the 50s, where Julius Caesar was rapidly bringing huge amounts of territory in Gaul under control. And he was obviously kept very well informed of what was going on in Rome, and he was obviously going to have to challenge Pompey's position of supremacy. And of course, when the Senate didn't allow Caesar to stand for the consulship in absentia, but required him to come to Rome to attend the hustings, that was enough for Caesar, and he marched his army back into Italy, crossing the Rubicon, and of course beginning the Great Civil War against Pompey in 49. Now, after Caesar's victory in that civil war, he too then started to develop unprecedented positions. So this was really showing that the Republic was dead. The old system was just not working. And after, in many ways, Pompey and Caesar had created positions that became something of a model for later emperors to adopt, and some of the practices were brought back under the later emperors. But the solution was indeed autocracy. It was that. After another 15 years of hugely devastating civil war following the assassination of Julius Caesar, the Roman people had had enough. They could no longer tolerate this violence in politics, the endemic civil wars. So they agreed that the only solution was indeed to allow a powerful, centralizing figure to take control of the system. Now, the violent years of the late Republic were very well remembered, I think, in the imperial period. The political thuggery, the use of gangs, open street violence in politics, and indeed the use of the army and the frequent resort to civil wars was something people remembered and something they did not want to go back to. So they were willing to sacrifice some degree of political liberty to make sure that the system worked once again. And autocracy was the solution they came up with.